Did Obi-Wan ever forgive himself for failing Anakin? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. When going into exile, Master Kenobi had a lot of things on his mind. The ending of the Jedi as he knew it, and the Republic as well, was so much more than just the end of an era. It was the ending of galactic peace and prosperity as Kenobi knew it. With the Sith ruling the galaxy, Obi-Wan, like many Jedi, was now living with a dark cloud over his head. But none of that compared to the back-breaking guilt he carried with him over what happened to his Padawan, his brother, Anakin Skywalker. This heartbreak is explored heavily in the Kenobi Legends novel and in the canon Obi-Wan Kenobi series, as Obi-Wan wrestles day and night with his shame and sorrow, driving himself mad with constant what-ifs. But in today's Holocron, we wanted to dive deeply into the aftermath of Obi-Wan's grief and ask the simple question: did Obi-Wan ever move past what occurred? Did he ever find it in his heart to forgive himself? Many debate over whether or not Anakin was truly Obi-Wan's failure, and while it can be argued all day long, there isn't a doubt that Obi-Wan certainly had a hand in his apprentice's downfall. But whether or not we agree, Kenobi himself still carries this shame regardless. He had taken on an apprentice far too young. He had just only broken out of his Padawan years when Qui-Gon died. He ignored the misgivings of Grandmaster Yoda and took on training one of the most difficult students that the Jedi had ever seen. Kenobi later acknowledged that he was far too hard on Anakin, lecturing him instead of listening to him. Having joined the Order much later in life, Anakin had attachments to his mother, attachments which carried a myriad of different fears and concerns for those around him, fears that Obi-Wan did not understand, which isn't a problem in and of itself. But Obi-Wan didn't really take the time to try and understand Anakin. He chalked his Padawan's behavior as him being a brash and a moody teenager, one in need of a good lecturing. He even knew about Anakin and Padme's marriage, but said nothing in order to keep the peace. He always thought that by doing this he was protecting Anakin, hiding his secret from the rest of the council. In reality though, Obi-Wan allowed a layer of mistrust to grow between himself and his brother. And for all their good as a team on the battlefield, they could not relate to each other as men. As time went on, Anakin would turn to Palpatine as a father figure for advice, and though Obi-Wan felt wrong about this, he again said nothing and thought it was harmless. But there were red flags with the Chancellor of the Republic getting so friendly with one specific Jedi. The Jedi did have dealings with the Senate, but the job was regulated to specific Jedi diplomats and the Council of Reconciliation. Interestingly, only the High Council itself dealt directly with the office of the Chancellor, so for a Jedi Padawan of all things to have frequent visits from Palpatine, it made the Council very uncomfortable, especially when the Chancellor began insisting on volunteering Anakin for complicated tasks to improve his reputation. Not only did this boost Skywalker's ego, but it upset the balance of the Council, who was seeing Anakin's friendship with Palpatine as something to be concerned over. And yet, rather than approach his own student, Obi-Wan defended him to the Masters again, not wanting to rock the boat on his end with Anakin's already tense relationship. Obi-Wan's silence and avoidance of conflict did nothing to help the situation like he thought it would, hoping the problem would go away if it wasn't addressed instead of listening and trying to solve it as Qui-Gon would have. And as a result, disaster. While it was true he had no direct hand in Anakin's fall, he was certainly complacent with it. This is what Obi-Wan meant when he told Vader on Mustafar that he had failed him. Obi-Wan would stew on these emotions for years, talking about several entries in his journal about his mistakes. He begged for forgiveness for a man that no longer existed, and this journal would later be passed down to be read by Luke. But one thing needs to be made clear. Obi-Wan did not struggle with this pain for the entirety of his life in exile, though it was brought to a whole new level when he found out Vader was still alive. In Legends, Obi-Wan finds out about Vader's survival over the HoloNet recording in a cantina. He is in fact so shocked by the information that he is whirled into a panic and falls on the floor, garnering a lot of concern from the other patrons. His mind was blank and fuzzy, and he could only think about the fact that Anakin was alive. Somehow he had survived the dismemberment and scorching of Mustafar that Obi-Wan had witnessed. When he saw Anakin burn, he left him there to allow the Force to decide his fate. But for all intents and purposes, he felt Anakin Skywalker die in the Force and in his heart. So the fact that Vader was alive, walking around as a cyborg to keep himself alive, a new kind of grief and terror overcame Obi-Wan. He realized not only had he failed his friend, but had sentenced him to a life of torment that no living being should ever suffer. And now that being was going around killing Jedi. Obi-Wan recognized that he had created a monster, and now had something new to hate himself over. But in the Obi-Wan series and canon, this would change the day that he actually met Vader. The two would duel on the barren planet, where Kenobi would slash open his mask to gaze into the eye of his old friend. It was then when he saw the scars of the disfigurement, the full weight of what he had become, what Anakin had become, settled on his mind. With tears in his eyes, he apologized for all of it. Those words were something that he had desperately wanted to tell Anakin since that moment on Mustafar. For 10 years, he had wrestled with the agony of his choices, not just the mutilation, but the complacency he had that led up to Anakin's fall. But Darth Vader looked his former master in the eye and denied that it was ever his fault. This wasn't the moment that Anakin was consoling a friend, a moment in which Vader wanted to take credit for something Obi-Wan was blaming himself for. You didn't kill Anakin Skywalker. I did. In that moment, a completely new mindset flooded over Obi-Wan like a rising sunlight cascading across a landscape. Anakin was dead. He hadn't fallen because of Obi-Wan, at least not entirely. Anakin had been murdered. Looking at Vader, he was no longer looking into the eyes of a victim. He was looking into the eyes of the killer responsible for it. And here, Vader ceased to be even human to Obi-Wan, and his mind rationalized it like this. He is more machine than man, twisted and evil. Vader betrayed and murdered Anakin, just as he betrayed and murdered the Jedi. Obi-Wan couldn't so much as bring himself to say Vader's name. Instead, he calls him Darth. He refers to him by the classic Sith title, because now, that is all that Vader is to him. He has become nothing but the purest form of evil, the blackest of darkness, only characterized by the Sith title of Darth. Obi-Wan would go on to mourn his apprentice finally, but not as a personal failure that he was responsible for, but mourning a righteous warrior, one who had been maliciously killed in a fight for his life. Yes, Obi-Wan would go on to basically lie to Luke in separating Vader from Anakin as two separate people, framing Vader as a murderer of Luke's father. But in Obi-Wan's certain point of view, that is exactly what happened. It was the only way his mind could reconcile with what his friend had become, because there was no way that Anakin was responsible for the death of his wife, the destruction of the Jedi, for the willful enslavement of the galaxy, the rise of the Sith, the deaths of children. It was impossible. It was only because of Vader. Only a Darth who betrayed and murdered his friend was capable of this. He was not a man. He was a machine capable of only destruction. Finally, he was able to move on from Anakin's death, forgive himself for his perceived wrongdoings, and of course as a result, Obi-Wan would attempt to impart that idea onto Luke. He believed that redeeming Vader was an impossibility. No good existed within him anymore. He attempted to convince Luke that Darth Vader was nothing more than a dragon to be slain. Obi-Wan, for good reason, had given up on all hope, but it was necessary for him to do this. Otherwise, he would have never accepted what Anakin Skywalker had become, what he had chosen to become. Anakin Skywalker was truly dead to Obi-Wan, and this is why he was finally able to forgive himself, at least partially. The conclusion he came to wasn't so much forgiveness, as it was a coping mechanism. The friend he fought beside and trusted his life to for so many years could not possibly be the monster behind that black mask. And because of that, Obi-Wan was finally able to move on, and accepted that Anakin was dead. But my friends, does this make sense? And in your opinion, how accountable is Obi-Wan for Anakin's fall? As always, may the Force be with you, and I hope you're having a phenomenal day.